The leather binding on Eleanor Wade's small journal had grown so soft from handling that it felt like cloth beneath her fingers as she sat on the porch of the general store in Silver Creek, Montana Territory in the spring of 1882, watching the dust devils dance down the main street while she tried not to think about the fact that her father's debts were about to swallow everything she had left in this world. She opened the book to a fresh page, her pencil poised above the paper, as she considered what new worry to add to the collection that filled nearly every line of the previous 40 pages. The store was quiet this Tuesday afternoon, and Eleanor had learned long ago that writing down her troubles made them feel smaller somehow, more manageable, even when they threatened to crush her under their weight. Her father had been dead for 3 months now, killed when his horse threw him on the way back from Bozeman, and every day since had brought new revelations about just how deeply Thomas Wade had buried himself in debt before that final ride. Eleanor was 22 years old, unmarried, and now the sole proprietor of a general store that owed money to suppliers in 3 different territories. She had customers who paid on credit she could not afford to extend, and creditors who wanted cash she did not have. The bank in town had already informed her that foreclosure was a strong possibility if she could not make her payments by the end of summer. She wrote these facts in her careful script, the pencil scratching against the rough paper as she documented her reality. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up from her writing. A lone rider was coming down the street, moving at an easy pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry. Eleanor closed her book instinctively, holding it against her chest as she watched the stranger approach. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dark hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and he rode with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on his own 2 feet. He stopped his horse directly in front of the store, swinging down from the saddle with fluid grace. When he looked up at her, Eleanor found herself meeting a pair of steady gray eyes set in a sun-weathered face that she judged to be perhaps 27 or 28 years old. He had the lean, rangy build of a working cowboy, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested competence and quiet strength. "Afternoon, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was a low rumble, polite but not deferential. "This the general store?" "It is," Eleanor said, rising from her chair and tucking her journal into the pocket of her apron. "What can I help you with?" "Name's James Holloway," he said, climbing the steps to the porch. "I'm the new foreman out at the Circle M Ranch. Mr. Morrison sent me into town to set up a store account and pick up some supplies." Eleanor felt a small flutter of hope in her chest. The Circle M was one of the larger ranches in the area, and their business would be valuable. "Of course, Mr. Holloway. Please come inside and we can discuss terms." She led him into the dim interior of the store, which smelled of tobacco, coffee, and the faint sweetness of the penny candy she kept in glass jars on the counter. The shelves were reasonably well stocked, though she had been carefully rationing her orders to stretch her available credit as far as possible. James Holloway followed her to the counter, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and she noticed that he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg just a touch. "Mr. Morrison has good credit here," Eleanor said, pulling out her father's old ledger book and opening it to a fresh page. "I can certainly set up an account for ranch purchases. What did you need today?" James pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. The boss wrote out a list, mostly basic supplies, some rope, tobacco, coffee, that sort of thing. Eleanor scanned the list, mentally calculating the total as she went. It was a substantial order, the kind that would help her make this month's payment to her biggest supplier. She began gathering items from the shelves, and James moved to help her without being asked, reaching for the higher items that would have required her to fetch the ladder. "You hurt your leg?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal for a first meeting, too forward, but James did not seem offended. "Bull kicked me about 5 years back," he said matter-of-factly. "Shattered the bone pretty good. Doc did what he could, but it healed a little short. Doesn't slow me down much, except I probably should not enter any foot races." Eleanor smiled at that, surprised by his easy humor about what must have been a painful injury. "I imagine foot races are not a common requirement for ranch work." "Not so far," James agreed. He set a coil of rope on the counter and reached for a sack of coffee beans. "You run this place by yourself?" "I do now," Eleanor said, and there must have been something in her tone because James looked at her more closely. "Now?" he asked gently. "My father passed 3 months ago," Eleanor explained, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "It was sudden. He was thrown from his horse." "I'm sorry to hear that," James said, and there was genuine sympathy in his eyes. "That's a hard thing, losing a parent, and running a business alone on top of it cannot be easy." Eleanor shrugged, trying to seem more casual about it than she felt. "We do what we must." She finished gathering his supplies and tallied the total in the ledger. James watched her work with quiet attention, and she found his presence oddly comforting rather than intrusive. There was something solid about him, something steady that made her feel just a little less alone than she had been an hour ago. "I'll be coming to town for supplies pretty regular," James said as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper and tied them with string. "The Circle M does a fair amount of business, so you will probably be seeing me at least once a week, maybe more." "I would appreciate that," Eleanor said honestly. "Good customers are the backbone of any store." James hefted the packages, then paused as if considering something. "You look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, if you do not mind me saying so. If there is anything I can do to help while I'm in town, you just let me know." Eleanor felt a sudden, unexpected urge to tell him everything. About the debts, about the creditors, about the sleepless nights she spent trying to figure out how to save her father's store from the auction block. But she barely knew this man, and she had learned long ago that admitting weakness was often an invitation for others to take advantage. "That is kind of you," she said instead. "I will keep that in mind." James nodded, accepting her deflection without pushing. "I will see you next week then, Miss Wade." "Eleanor," she said impulsively. "You can call me Eleanor." "Eleanor," James repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his low voice. "I will see you next week, Eleanor." She watched him load his packages onto his horse and ride away, heading north toward the Circle M range. Only after he disappeared from view did she realize that she felt lighter somehow, as if his offer of help, even unaccepted, had lifted some small portion of the burden she carried. That evening, after she had locked up the store and climbed the stairs to the small apartment above where she lived alone, Eleanor opened her journal again. She meant to add more worries to the list, to document the conversation she had overheard earlier in the week about the bank's plans for her property. Instead, she found herself writing about gray eyes and a steady voice, and a man who had offered help without expecting anything in return. She felt foolish as soon as she had written it, and she almost crossed out the words. But something stopped her, some small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there could be more in her life than worry and work and the constant struggle to keep her head above water. The week passed slowly. Eleanor served her regular customers, extended credit she could not afford, and lay awake at night adding figures in her head that never came out to anything but loss. She cleaned the store until it gleamed, reorganized her inventory, and tried not to think about how many of the items on her shelves she had bought on credit that was coming due. On Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after his first visit, James Holloway rode into town again. Eleanor saw him coming from her usual spot on the porch, and she was horrified to realize that her heart had sped up at the sight of him. She forced herself to remain seated, to appear casual, even though every fiber of her being wanted to stand up and greet him like he was an old friend rather than a near stranger. "Afternoon, Eleanor," James said as he dismounted. He was smiling, a small, quiet expression that nonetheless transformed his serious face into something warmer. "How has your week been?" "Busy enough," Eleanor said, rising from her chair. She noticed that he had her journal in her hands and quickly tucked it into her apron pocket again. "And yours?" "Cattle do not care much about a man's schedule," James said with a shrug. "We have been moving the herd to summer pasture. It is honest work but tiring." They went inside together, and this time the ritual of gathering supplies felt easier, more familiar. James knew where things were kept now, and he moved around the store with comfortable familiarity, reaching for items without needing to be directed. They worked in companionable silence, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in his presence in a way she rarely did with anyone. "I have been thinking about what you said last week," James said suddenly as Eleanor was wrapping his purchases, "about doing what we must. It struck me that you meant more by that than just running the store." Eleanor's hands stilled on the package she was wrapping. She looked up to find James watching her with those steady gray eyes, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to trust him. "My father left debts," she said quietly, "a lot of them. I'm trying to pay them off, but it is like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. Every time I think I am making progress, another creditor shows up with another bill I did not know about." James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "How bad is it?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Bad enough that the bank has mentioned foreclosure. I have until the end of summer to catch up on my payments, or I lose everything." "Have you thought about selling?" James asked. "Who would buy a failing business, your boor?" Eleanor countered. "And even if someone did, the sale price would barely cover the debts. I would be left with nothing, not even the roof over my head." James leaned against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "What if you had some help? Someone to invest in the business, help you expand and bring in more customers?" Eleanor shook her head. "I could not ask anyone to take on that kind of risk. It would not be fair." "What if they offered?" James asked quietly. Eleanor stared at him. "You? You barely know me. Why would you want to invest in a store that is drowning in debt?" "Because I see potential here," James said simply. "This is a good store in a growing town. With the railroad coming through in the next few years, Silver Creek is going to boom. Right now you are just scraping by, but with some capital and some smart decisions, this place could be a gold mine." "The railroad is still years away," Eleanor said, but she felt that flutter of hope again. Dangerous and tempting. "Maybe," James agreed, "but that gives us time to build up a solid foundation. And I'm not talking about a handout, Eleanor. I'm talking about a partnership. You have the store and the knowledge of how to run it. I have some money saved up from my years working ranches, and I have a good head for numbers. We could work together to turn this place around." Eleanor wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto this lifeline with both hands, but years of caution held her back. "Why would you do this? What is in it for you?" James was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Honest answer? I have been saving up to buy my own ranch someday, but land prices keep going up faster than I can save. This could be a good investment, a way to build up capital faster than just squirreling away my wages. And if I am being completely honest, I like you, Eleanor Wade. I like the way you face your problems head on instead of running from them. I think we could make a good team." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush at his words. "You like me? You barely know me." "I know enough," James said. "I know you work hard. I know you're honest. I know you care about this store and this town. That is enough for me to take a chance on." Eleanor looked down at her hands, her mind racing. It was a risk, bringing in a partner. What if they disagreed about how to run things? What if his investment was not enough? What if she failed and lost not only her own money, but his as well? But the alternative was certain failure, slow and inevitable, watching as the store her father had built slipped away piece by piece until there was nothing left. "I would want it all in writing," Eleanor said slowly. "A proper partnership agreement drawn up by a lawyer, everything clear and legal." James smiled, and this time the expression reached his eyes. "I would not have it any other way. We can ride over to Helena next week and have papers drawn up proper. Until then, how about I advance you enough to make this month's bank payment? Call it a show of good faith." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this man, would not show him just how desperate she had become. "That would be helpful," she managed. "Thank you, James." "We are partners now," James said, "or we will be once the papers are signed. Partners help each other out. That's the whole point." Over the next several weeks, as spring bloomed into early summer across the Montana Territory, Eleanor found her life transforming in ways she had never anticipated. True to his word, James advanced her the money for her bank payment, enough to buy her breathing room and keep the foreclosure at bay. They made the trip to Helena together, a full day's ride each way, and had partnership papers drawn up by a lawyer who charged them a small fortune, but produced documents that were clear and fair. The partnership was structured so that James owned 40% of the business, with Eleanor retaining controlling interest at 60%. He had the right to consultation on major decisions, but could not override her choices without her agreement. It was fair and generous, more so than Eleanor had expected, and she signed her name on the documents, feeling like she had just been thrown a lifeline when she was on the verge of drowning. With James's investment and his head for figures, they began to make real progress on the debts. He went through all of her father's records with a careful eye, organizing the creditors by priority, and negotiating payment plans that were more manageable than the demands Eleanor had been facing alone. He had a calm, reasonable way of talking to people that made even the most aggressive creditors willing to work with them, and slowly, steadily, the mountain of debt began to shrink. But it was not just the business partnership that was growing. Eleanor found herself looking forward to James's visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with store business and everything to do with the way her heart beat faster when she saw him riding into town. They fell into a routine where he would arrive on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, officially to check on store business and pick up supplies, but they both knew it was an excuse to spend time together. They would sit on the porch after the store closed, watching the sun set over the mountains while they talked about everything and nothing. James told her about growing up on a small ranch in Wyoming, about losing his mother to pneumonia when he was 15, and his father to a range war 2 years later. He'd been on his own since then, working ranches across 3 territories, saving every penny he could toward his dream of someday having land of his own. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Silver Creek, about her mother who had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Eleanor was 10, about the way her father had retreated into his business and his debts after that, shutting her out emotionally even as he relied on her labor in the store. She told him things she had never told anyone, and he listened without judgment, his steady presence making it safe to speak truths she had kept locked inside for years. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, James reached over and took her hand. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at the contact, his palm warm and calloused against hers. "I need to tell you something," James said quietly, "and I want you to know that it will not change our business partnership regardless of how you respond. The store is doing well, and we are partners no matter what. But I need to say this, Eleanor, because keeping it inside is about to drive me crazy." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you," James said, his voice steady and sure. "Maybe I have been since the first day I saw you sitting on this porch with that worried look on your face and that little book in your hands. I know we have not known each other long, and I know you have enough on your plate without me adding complications, but I promised myself I would be honest with you. And the honest truth is that I think about you every minute of every day. You are the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I would count myself the luckiest man alive if you would let me court you properly." Eleanor could hardly breathe. She had been half in love with James Holloway for weeks now, but she had convinced herself it was just gratitude, just relief at having someone to share her burdens with. But looking at him now in the fading light, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes as he waited for her answer, she knew it was so much more than that. "I have a worn little book where I keep all my worries," Eleanor said softly. "Every fear, every problem, every sleepless night goes in that book. I've been writing in it since my mother died, and it has always been my way of coping with everything life throws at me." James nodded, his hand still holding hers. "I have seen you with it. You do not have to explain." "But I want to," Eleanor said, "because ever since you came into my life, I've been writing different things in that book, not just worries anymore, but hopes too, dreams about what the future might look like. And you are in all of those dreams, James. Every single one." James's expression transformed, hope and joy flooding into his eyes. "Does that mean—" "Yes," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I would like that very much. I am falling in love with you too, James Holloway, and I have been terrified to admit it because it seemed too good to be true, but I do not want to be afraid anymore. I want to see where this goes. James stood up, pulling her gently to her feet, and then his hands were on either side of her face and he was kissing her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. Eleanor melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing she had been trying to deny. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to marry you someday, Eleanor Wade," he murmured, "if you will have me." "Someday," Eleanor agreed, smiling against his lips, "but let us take it one day at a time. We still have a business to save and debts to pay." "We will do it together," James said firmly, "every step of the way." And they did. Over the summer months, as their love deepened and grew, they also transformed the store from a struggling business into a thriving one. James proved to have excellent instincts for what products would sell well, and he negotiated deals with suppliers that gave them better prices and terms. Eleanor used her knowledge of the community to expand their customer base, reaching out to ranchers and miners who had previously done their shopping in other towns. They added new product lines, things that other stores in the area did not carry, farm equipment, specialized tools, even some ready-made clothing that proved popular with bachelor cowboys who had no wives to sew for them. The store became known as the place to find what you needed, and customers came from increasing distances to shop there. By late August, they had paid off more than half of the outstanding debts. The bank was satisfied with their progress and had removed the threat of foreclosure. Eleanor could breathe again without feeling the constant weight of impending disaster on her shoulders. She still kept her little book, still wrote in it regularly, but now the entries were a mix of minor concerns and major gratitudes. James had moved into the boarding house in town, taking a room there so he could be close to the store and to Eleanor. He still worked at the Circle M, but Mr. Morrison had been understanding about his need for flexible hours to help with the store business. James was too good a foreman to lose, and the rancher valued his work enough to accommodate his partnership with Eleanor. They spent every evening together, sometimes working on store business, sometimes just sitting together and talking or reading aloud to each other from the newspaper that came in weekly from Helena. James was teaching Eleanor to ride better, taking her out on Sunday afternoons to explore the countryside around Silver Creek. She was teaching him to cook more than just basic trail food, and they would make dinner together in her little apartment above the store, laughing and stealing kisses between stirring pots and setting the table. It was a golden time, and Eleanor found herself happier than she had ever been in her life. The grief for her father was still there, a low ache that never quite went away, but it was tempered now by joy and hope and the steady presence of a man who loved her for exactly who she was. In September, as the aspens began to turn gold on the mountainsides and the air took on the crisp bite of approaching autumn, James proposed to her properly. He took her up to a high meadow above town, a place with a view that stretched for miles across the valley. They had packed a picnic lunch, and after they ate, James got down on one knee in the wildflowers and pulled out a simple gold band. "I know we said we would take it one day at a time," James said, looking up at her with those steady gray eyes that she loved so much. "But I have taken a lot of days now, Eleanor, and every single one of them has made me more certain that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband and your partner in everything, not just business, but life?" Eleanor was crying openly now, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, dropping to her knees in front of him so they were eye to eye. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you, James Holloway, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." James slipped the ring onto her finger, and then they were kissing again, falling back into the wildflowers together, wrapped in each other's arms under the wide Montana sky. Eleanor felt like her heart might burst from happiness, like all the worry and fear and struggle of the past year had been leading to this exact moment. They were married in late October, on a crisp autumn day when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at it. The ceremony was held in the small church in Silver Creek, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Mr. Morrison came from the Circle M, along with a dozen cowboys from the ranch. Eleanor's regular customers filled the pews, along with the few friends she had maintained through the difficult months after her father's death. Eleanor wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had ordered special from a catalog, and James wore a new suit that he had purchased in Helena. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothing, tugging at his collar during the ceremony, but Eleanor thought he was the most handsome man she had ever seen. When they exchanged vows, his voice was strong and sure, and she felt the truth of his promises in the very marrow of her bones. The reception was held at the store, which they had cleared of merchandise and decorated with fall flowers and ribbons. There was food and music and dancing, and Eleanor laughed until her sides ached as James spun her around the makeshift dance floor. He was not a graceful dancer, his limp making the steps awkward, but he did not care, and neither did she. They were married, they were together, and that was all that mattered. That night in the apartment above the store that was now their shared home, James undressed her slowly and carefully, treating her like something precious and fragile. Eleanor had been nervous about the wedding night, uncertain what to expect, but James was patient and tender and made sure she felt safe every step of the way. When they finally came together, it was with a joy and intimacy that left them both breathless and amazed. Afterwards, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, James ran his fingers through her loose hair and murmured, "Tell me your worries." Eleanor laughed softly. "I do not have any right now. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I am not worried about anything." "Then tell me your hopes," James said. "Tell me what you dream about when you write in that little book of yours." Eleanor turned in his arms so she could see his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I dream about this," she said honestly. "About us, together, building a life. I dream about the store growing and thriving. I dream about maybe someday having children who will grow up knowing they are loved and wanted and safe." James kissed her forehead gently. "Those are good dreams. We will make them all come true, Eleanor Holloway, every single one." The winter that followed was cold but comfortable. They had the store well stocked and the debts under control, and they spent the long evenings by the fire planning for the future. James had been right about Silver Creek's potential. Word had come through official channels that the railroad would indeed be coming through their region, with Silver Creek designated as one of the major stops. Land prices were already starting to rise, and new families were moving into the area every week. They expanded the store again, buying the building next door when it came up for sale and knocking through the wall to create a much larger retail space. They hired 2 employees to help with the increased traffic, a young man named Peter who wanted to learn the business, and a widow named Mrs. Henshaw who had a gift for dealing with difficult customers. By spring, the store was not just stable, but genuinely profitable. They finished paying off the last of her father's debts in March, and Eleanor cried when she wrote the final check and closed the ledger on that chapter of her life. James held her while she wept, understanding that these were tears of grief as much as relief, mourning for her father who had tried his best even if that best had not been enough. In May, Eleanor realized that she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice and was experiencing morning sickness that left her queasy and exhausted. She told James one evening after dinner, too nervous to wait for a more romantic moment, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the room despite his bad leg, laughing and whooping with pure joy. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying over and over, like he could not quite believe it. "Eleanor, we are going to be parents." "I know," Eleanor said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you happy? Are you ready for this?" "I have never been more ready for anything in my life," James said firmly. He set her down gently and placed his hand on her still flat stomach with wonder in his eyes. "This baby is going to be so loved, Eleanor, so wanted and cherished and protected. I promise you that." The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from terrible morning sickness well into her 4th month, and there were days when she could barely keep anything down. James was endlessly patient, bringing her dry toast and ginger tea, sitting with her when she was too ill to get out of bed, running the store when she could not manage it herself. But as the pregnancy progressed and the sickness finally passed, Eleanor found herself blooming. She loved being pregnant, loved the way her body changed and grew to accommodate the life inside her. James was fascinated by every development, placing his hands on her belly to feel the baby kick, talking to their child through her skin. They prepared the spare room in the apartment as a nursery, painting it yellow since they did not know whether they were having a boy or a girl. James built a cradle with his own hands, working in the back room of the store during slow periods, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk. Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as her heart swelled with anticipation. In January of 1884, in the dead of winter with snow piled high outside the windows, Eleanor went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting nearly 18 hours, but James stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, both of them wept with relief and joy. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair, and his father's gray eyes and tiny, perfect fingers that gripped Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but radiant, as she held their son for the first time. "Thomas," James said quietly, "after your father, if that is all right with you." Eleanor looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "That is perfect. Thomas James Holloway." "Tom," James said, touching his son's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "Hello, Tom. Welcome to the world, little man." Becoming parents transformed them in ways both profound and mundane. The store continued to thrive, but now it had to work around feeding schedules and diaper changes and sleepless nights. They took turns getting up with Tom when he cried, and they learned to function on far less sleep than they had ever thought possible. But the love they felt for their son was overwhelming, a fierce protective tenderness that made every sacrifice worthwhile. James proved to be a natural father, patient and playful, singing silly songs to Tom and walking the floor with him for hours when he was fussy. Eleanor watched them together and felt her heart swell with gratitude for this life they had built. The store continued to expand as Silver Creek grew. The railroad arrived in 1885, just as predicted, and the town's population doubled almost overnight. New businesses opened, new families moved in, and the general store became a cornerstone of the community. They hired more employees, expanded again into a third building, and began carrying merchandise that ranged from farming equipment to fine china. James had been right about the potential for growth, and his early investment had paid off handsomely. They were not wealthy, not by the standards of the big city merchants, but they were comfortable and secure in a way that Eleanor had never dreamed possible during those dark days after her father's death. When Tom was 2 years old, Eleanor found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, with less sickness and more energy. Their daughter Clara was born in the autumn of 1886, a tiny, delicate thing with Eleanor's dark eyes and a temperament that was significantly calmer than her brother's had been. Tom was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her and hold her and help with everything. James taught him to be gentle, and Eleanor's heart melted watching her son carefully pat his sister's back under his father's supervision. They were a family now, complete and happy. And Eleanor often found herself stopping in the middle of ordinary moments to marvel at how much her life had changed. She still kept her little book, but now the entries were mostly gratitudes and happy memories. The worries were still there, but they were the normal concerns of any parent and business owner, nothing like the crushing fear that had once filled those pages. One evening when Clara was about 6 months old and Tom was playing quietly with wooden blocks near the fireplace, James found Eleanor writing in her journal. He sat down beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. "What are you writing?" he asked gently. Eleanor smiled and showed him the page. "I am writing about the day you first came to the store, about how you asked if you could help with my worries, and how I was too scared to accept at first." James kissed her temple. "You let me help eventually." "You were the answer to all of them," Eleanor said softly. "Every worry I had, every fear, every problem that seemed insurmountable, you walked into my life and helped me solve every single one. You were my answer, James Holloway, and I thank God every day that you stopped at my store that afternoon." "I was just a cowboy looking for supplies," James said, but there was emotion thick in his voice. "You were so much more than that," Eleanor said. "You were everything I needed, even though I did not know it yet. You were my partner, my friend, my love, my husband, my answer to everything." James took the journal from her hands and set it aside, then pulled her close. "You saved me too, you know. I was just drifting before I met you, working ranches and saving money with no real purpose beyond some vague dream of someday having land. You gave me a reason, Eleanor. You gave me a home and a family and a future worth building." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their children, listening to the fire crackle in the hearth. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes drifting past the windows, but inside they were warm and safe and surrounded by love. The years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythms of work and family. Tom grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping in the store, learning to count and make change almost before he could read. Clara was quieter but equally smart, with a gift for remembering what customers had purchased before and what they might need. In 1889, when Tom was 5 and Clara was 3, Eleanor gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Michael and Rose. The pregnancy had been a surprise, and twins were a shock, but James took it all in stride, simply building 2 more cradles and expanding the nursery into what had been their bedroom, while they moved their own bed into the sitting room. The apartment above the store was bursting at the seams with 6 people, so they began making plans to build a proper house. They had the money now and the land, a nice lot at the edge of town with views of the mountains. James drew up plans during the winter, and construction began in the spring of 1890. The house was finished by autumn, a beautiful 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There was a room on the first floor that served as James's office, where he managed the business paperwork and bookkeeping, and another that Eleanor claimed as a sewing room. Moving into their own house felt like the final piece of their life together clicking into place. They no longer had to live above the store, no longer had to mix their home life quite so thoroughly with their business. The children had a yard to play in, and Eleanor had a kitchen large enough to cook proper family dinners. The store continued under the capable management of Peter, who had learned the business well over the years, and Mrs. Henshaw, who could handle any customer with grace and efficiency. Eleanor and James still spent time there every day, but they no longer had to be present every minute. They had built something that could run without their constant oversight, and that freedom was precious. As the children grew, the house filled with laughter and noise and the wonderful chaos of a large family. Tom started school and proved to be an excellent student, particularly gifted with numbers. Clara was more interested in people, always making friends, always organizing games and activities for the neighborhood children. Michael was adventurous and fearless, constantly climbing things and giving Eleanor heart attacks. Rose was the baby in every way, sweet and cuddly and content to be everyone's pet. James was an involved father in a way that was unusual for the time. He changed diapers and braided hair and attended school programs. He taught Tom and Michael to ride and rope, but he also made sure Clara and Rose learned those same skills. He wanted his daughters to be independent and capable, able to take care of themselves in any situation. Eleanor watched him with their children and fell in love with him all over again every single day. He was patient when they needed patience, firm when they needed discipline, and always, always present. He kept his promises, every single one, and their children grew up knowing absolutely that they were loved. In 1895, when Tom was 11 and starting to think about his future, he came to his parents with a request. I want to learn everything about the store, he said seriously. I want to know how to run it, how to keep the books, how to order inventory, everything, because someday I want to take over if that is all right with you. Eleanor looked at James, and they shared a smile. I think that would be wonderful, she said, but you need to finish school first. Education is important, Tom. I know, Tom said, but I can learn both, cannot I? School during the day and the store in the evenings and on Saturdays. And so Tom became the next generation of Wade Holloway merchants, learning the business from the ground up. James taught him with patience and thoroughness, and Eleanor contributed her knowledge of customers and community. By the time Tom was 15, he could run the store as well as any of the adult employees. Clara, meanwhile, had developed an interest in medicine. She was fascinated by the doctor who came through town periodically, asking him questions and reading every medical book she could get her hands on. I want to be a nurse, she announced when she was 13, maybe even a doctor, if they will let a woman study. James and Eleanor encouraged her dreams, even though they knew the path would be difficult. Women doctors were rare, and the training was expensive and hard to come by. But they had raised their daughter to believe she could do anything she set her mind to, and they would support her however they could. Michael showed an interest in ranching, spending all his free time out at the Circle M with the Cowboys. Mr. Morrison, now in his 70s but still sharp, took the boy under his wing and taught him everything about cattle and horses and managing land. That boy has a gift, the old rancher told James. If you ever want to invest in cattle, I would be happy to partner with you and let Michael run things. Rose, the youngest, was only 6, still figuring out what she loved. But she was artistic, always drawing and painting, and Eleanor thought she might have inherited some creative talent from her grandmother, Eleanor's mother, who had been known for her beautiful quilts before her death. The years passed in a blur of birthdays and holidays, school programs and church socials, everyday moments that built a lifetime of memories. Eleanor and James watched their children grow, marveling at the individuals they were becoming, so different from each other but all marked by the security and love of their upbringing. In 1899, as the new century approached, Eleanor and James celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The children surprised them with a party, inviting what seemed like everyone in Silver Creek. The house was packed with friends and customers and people whose lives they had touched over the years. That night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, James and Eleanor sat on their porch swing, looking out at the stars. Eleanor had her old journal in her lap, and she was paging through it slowly, reading entries from years past. Listen to this, she said softly. This is from the day before we met. The bank says I have until August. I do not know how I'm going to save the store. I do not know how I'm going to survive this. I feel like I am drowning, and there is no one to throw me a rope. James squeezed her hand. But someone did throw you a rope. A cowboy asked if he could be the answer to some, Eleanor said, looking up at him with eyes bright with tears. Not just some, James. All of them. You answered every worry, every fear, every doubt. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. We gave each other that life, James corrected gently. You think I would be here, in this house with these children and this business without you? You were my answer too, Eleanor. You gave me purpose and direction and love. We saved each other. Eleanor closed the journal and set it aside. She did not need it anymore, not really. Oh, she still wrote in it occasionally, still liked having that outlet for her thoughts. But the desperate fear that had once filled its pages was long gone, replaced by contentment and gratitude and joy. They rocked together on the porch swing, listening to the sounds of the night, the crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, the wind rustling through the leaves of the cottonwood tree in their yard. Inside, their children slept safe and warm. The store was secure, profitable, a legacy they would pass down to the next generation. Their life together was everything they had hoped for and more. As the new century dawned, bringing with it changes and challenges that no one could predict, Eleanor and James faced it together, secure in their love and their partnership. Tom took over more and more of the store's daily operations, showing a natural talent for business that exceeded even his parents' abilities. Clara left for nursing school in Chicago, brave and determined, writing letters home that made Eleanor cry with pride. Michael went to work for the Circle M officially, and Mr. Morrison made good on his offer of a partnership, with James investing in a cattle operation that Michael would eventually inherit. Rose continued to develop her artistic talents, selling paintings to tourists who came through on the railroad, her work gaining recognition beyond their small town. In 1905, when Eleanor was 45 and James was 50, they became grandparents for the first time. Tom married a sweet girl named Sarah who helped in the store, and they had a baby boy they named James, after his grandfather. Eleanor held her grandson for the first time and marveled at the circle of life, at how the struggling young woman with a book full of worries had become this woman with a book full of blessings. Clara came home from nursing school briefly, bringing with her a young doctor she had met during her training. His name was David Chen, and he was one of the few Chinese-American physicians in the country, having fought prejudice and discrimination to earn his degree. Clara looked at him with such love that Eleanor recognized her own feelings for James reflected in her daughter's eyes. "We want to get married," Clara told her parents, "but we know it will be hard. Not everyone will accept us." James looked at the young couple, seeing the strength in both of them, the determination and the love. "Then those people do not matter," he said firmly. "You marry the person you love, Clara. We will support you, and we will make sure everyone in this town treats you both with respect." And they did. Clara and David were married in a simple ceremony in the Holloway's parlor, and James made it clear to everyone in Silver Creek that his daughter and son-in-law were to be welcomed and respected. Most people, knowing the Holloway's standing in the community, complied. Those who did not found their credit at the store suddenly less flexible, their orders delayed. James Holloway might be a kind man, but he was fiercely protective of his family, and everyone learned that lesson quickly. Clara and David set up a medical practice in Silver Creek, and they became beloved figures in the community, treating everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Eleanor was proud of her daughter beyond measure, proud of her skill and her compassion and her courage in choosing love over convention. Michael married a rancher's daughter named Annie in 1908, and they took over full management of the cattle operation. Rose shocked everyone by moving to San Francisco to pursue art seriously, but she came home regularly, and her paintings of Montana landscapes sold in galleries across the West. As Eleanor entered her 50s and then her 60s, she remained healthy and active, still involved in the store, though Tom had long since taken over its daily management. She and James had more time now, time to travel a bit, to visit their children and grandchildren, to simply enjoy each other's company after decades of hard work. They took a trip to San Francisco to visit Rose, marveling at the big city with its cable cars and restaurants and theaters. They traveled to Chicago to see where Clara had studied, walking through the great museums and parks. They even went back to Helena, the place where they had signed their partnership papers so many years ago, and laughed at how young and scared they had been. But they always came home to Silver Creek, to the house they had built and the life they had created. Montana was in their bones, the mountains and the sky and the wide open spaces. This was where they belonged, where their roots went deep into the soil. In 1917, when Eleanor was 57 and James was 62, the world was embroiled in the Great War. Their grandsons were of age to fight, and 2 of them enlisted despite their family's fears. Eleanor wrote to them every week, sending packages of socks and cookies and letters full of news from home. She prayed every night for their safe return, and by God's grace, both boys came home when the war ended, changed by what they had seen, but alive. The store continued to evolve with the times. They added a soda fountain in 1920, which became a popular gathering place for young people. They started carrying ready-made clothing exclusively, phasing out most of the dry goods as tastes changed. Tom proved to be even better at adapting to changing markets than his parents had been, and the business thrived. In 1925, James and Eleanor celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a massive party, with grandchildren running everywhere and great-grandchildren toddling around. The whole town turned out to honor the couple who had been fixtures in Silver Creek for more than 4 decades. Standing in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had served, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion. She thought about that young woman on the porch, clutching her book of worries, drowning in debt and fear and loneliness. She thought about the cowboy who had offered to help, who had seen potential where she saw only problems. James came to stand beside her, his hair silver now, but his eyes still that same steady gray. His limp was more pronounced these days, arthritis settling into the old injury, but he was still strong, still the rock on which she had built her life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Everything," Eleanor said simply. "Our whole life together. How it all started with a book full of worries and a cowboy who asked if he could help." "Best decision I ever made," James said, kissing her temple. "Offering to help you." "Best decision I ever made was letting you, James," Eleanor replied. They stood together watching their family celebrate, feeling the weight of years and love and shared history. They had built something remarkable, not just a successful business, but a legacy of love and strength that would continue long after they were gone. Eleanor still had her little book, worn now to the point of falling apart, the leather soft as butter, and the pages yellowed with age. She rarely wrote in it anymore, but she kept it on her bedside table, a reminder of where she had been and how far she had come. One evening, many years later, when Eleanor was 72 and James was 77, they sat together on their porch swing as they had done thousands of times before. James's health had been declining slowly, his heart not as strong as it once was, but he was still sharp mentally, still the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Eleanor," he said softly, taking her hand, "I need you to promise me something." Eleanor felt a chill of fear, but she kept her voice steady. "Anything. When I am gone, I want you to keep living, really living, not just existing. Visit the children, travel, do all the things you have always wanted to do. Do not lock yourself away in grief." "James," Eleanor said, her voice breaking, "I do not want to think about that." "I know," he said gently, "but we have to. We have had a remarkable life together, Eleanor, more than 50 years of love and partnership and joy. Most people never get what we have had. And when my time comes, I want you to remember that and be grateful for it, not bitter about it ending." Eleanor was crying now, unable to hold back the tears. "I will always be grateful, but I will also always miss you. You have been my everything, James Holloway." "And you have been mine," James said, pulling her close. "My love, my partner, my answer to every question I ever had about what I wanted from life. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since that first day on the store porch, and I will love you beyond death, wherever souls go when this life is done." They held each other as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside the house, they could hear their great-grandchildren playing, the next generation carrying on the legacy they had built. James lived another 3 years, passing peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935. Eleanor held his hand as he slipped away, whispering her love and gratitude, telling him she would see him again someday. The funeral was attended by hundreds, people from all over Montana who had been touched by James Holloway's kindness and integrity. Eleanor grieved deeply, but not desperately. She had known this day would come, had been preparing for it even as she hoped it never would. But James had made her promise to keep living, and she honored that promise. She traveled to visit each of her children, spending weeks with them, getting to know her grandchildren and great-grandchildren as individuals. She went to San Francisco and Chicago and even to New York, seeing things she had only read about in books. But she always came home to Silver Creek, to the house she and James had built, to the store that was now run by their grandson but still bore the Wade name. She lived independently until she was 87, sharp and active, a fixture in the town she had helped build. In the last year of her life, when her body finally began to fail, her children came home to care for her. Clara, now a respected physician in her own right, oversaw her mother's medical care with gentle competence. Tom made sure she had everything she needed, anticipating wants before she could voice them. Michael visited every day, bringing her flowers from his ranch. Rose came home from San Francisco and stayed, painting portraits of her mother that captured not just her face, but the strength and love that had defined her life. Eleanor spent her final weeks in the bedroom she had shared with James, surrounded by photographs of their life together, their children and grandchildren filling the walls. She had her little book beside her, and sometimes she would page through it, reading entries from 60 years earlier, marveling at how that frightened young woman had become this satisfied old one. One evening in early autumn, when the aspens were turning gold just as they had been when James proposed so many decades ago, Eleanor's children were all gathered in her room. She looked at each of them, seeing James in their faces, seeing the legacy of love they had created together. "I want to tell you something," she said, her voice weak but clear, "about the day I met your father. I was sitting on the store porch with a book full of worries, and he asked if he could be the answer to some. Not all, just some. But he ended up being the answer to everything that mattered. He gave me all of you. He gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. And when you remember us, remember that. Remember that love can transform everything, that partnership and faith and courage can overcome any obstacle." She looked at the little book on her bedside table, at the worn leather cover that had held so many years of worries and joys. And remember that worries are just worries. They feel overwhelming in the moment, but they do not have to define you. What defines you is how you face them and who you face them with. Eleanor closed her eyes, tired now, ready for rest. She could almost feel James beside her, his hand warm in hers, his voice murmuring that it was all right, that she could let go now. Their children held her hands and told her they loved her, and she smiled, feeling complete. She passed that night, slipping away as peacefully as James had, surrounded by love and family. Her funeral was even larger than James's had been, the whole town turning out to pay respects to the woman who had been a cornerstone of their community for more than 60 years. Tom found the little book after she was gone, carefully packed away with letters and photographs and mementos of a life well lived. He opened it, reading through the entries that chronicled his mother's journey from desperate young widow to beloved matriarch. On the very last page, written in her careful script, was a final entry dated just days before her death. "I kept my worries in this worn little book for most of my life. And the cowboy asked if he could be the answer to some. He became the answer to all of them. We built a life together that exceeded every dream I ever dared to dream. I am ready now to go where he waits for me to start whatever comes next. But I am grateful beyond measure for the life we shared here, for our children and grandchildren, for every single day we had together. If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing. I would choose him. I would choose love. I would choose this life every time. And I would hope that everyone who reads this understands that love, real love, is the answer to every question that matters." Tom shared the entry with his siblings, and they all wept, not just from grief, but from gratitude for the parents they had been blessed with. They decided to keep the store going, maintaining it as a family business that would pass down through the generations, a living monument to Eleanor and James and the love story that had started there. The worn little book was preserved carefully, eventually donated to the Historical Society, where it became a treasured artifact, a glimpse into the life of an ordinary woman who had faced extraordinary challenges with courage and grace. School children read excerpts from it, learning about life in the Old West, about the challenges of running a business, about love and partnership and building a family. But more than that, they learned the lesson that Eleanor had learned all those years ago on a dusty porch in Montana Territory, that when life threatens to overwhelm you, when your worries seem too big to bear, sometimes the answer comes in the form of a steady-eyed cowboy who offers to help, who sees your potential when you can only see your problems, who loves you not despite your struggles, but because of the strength you show in facing them. Eleanor Wade Holloway and James Holloway lived, loved, and built a legacy that endured long after their deaths. Their children prospered, their grandchildren thrived, and their great-great-grandchildren still walked the streets of Silver Creek, still shopped in the store that bore their family name, and sometimes on quiet evenings when the sun set gold over the mountains, people swore they could see two figures sitting on a porch swing, hands clasped, watching over the town they had helped build, together in death as they had been in life, forever and always.